literally go home and like learn programming on my own.
So at some point, you had this desire from way back to get into development, and you made it happen.
So I did start with like one free class. This is probably one of the benefits of being in San Francisco was there's just tons of free resources. I took this one free class on getting started with iOS development. That got me up and rolling.
I think you can be a great software engineer without being a great computer scientist, and potentially vice versa.
In America, we say like the squeaky wheel gets the grease,
Right.
which is like basically the annoying person gets helped.
Right.
Right, and in Japan they have the nail that sticks out gets hammered, so the annoying person gets hammered. I think you will experience that if you want to have eyes on you and want to stand out. I think Japan has very subtle ways of hammering you down. It's really hard to say, but like I definitely agree with the idea that not every place has to support every person. The reason I could jump from UX into software development just by learning by myself is because
Welcome to the Japan Dev Podcast. I'm Eric, founder of japandev.com, and today I'm sitting down with Jeff Bergier, who is a UX designer turned software engineer who's been in Japan now for about 6 years. He's been working at some really top companies, and I'm really excited to jump into this discussion and learn more about your experience. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here, and I also really enjoy your site. I share it with people all the time, so yeah, I'm very interested to participate.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to hear that the site has been useful. So yeah, just to start off, I think it would be good to just cover a little bit of your background. In particular, I'm curious, like, what was your initial kind of exposure to Japan?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, like not much. Like when I
Okay.
was a kid, I played Pokemon. I really liked Pokemon. I had the Game Boy games, first in
Okay.
black and white, then in color, that kind of
Nice.
situation.
An
Very old.
OG. Yep.
Yeah. But at no point doing Pokemon stuff did I really even think it was Japanese or like,
Mm,
oh, really, I want to move to Japan. So
mm,
there was nothing, no lifelong calling to move here.
mm. Okay. I think that is how most people get exposed to Japan, to be honest. It's not like, ooh, this Japanese game with these like monsters came out. It's more just like, oh yeah, this game's cool. I
Yeah,
like it.
yeah,
Right. And it's
yeah.
not
It's
some.
it's a little different than like Initial D, for example, to be very Japanese,
Yes.
right? But somehow Pokemon wasn't, right? It was
Mhm.
just like ours. We were just kids.
It is crazy how universal it is,
Yeah,
and like how it just really anyone can kind of put themselves in the world as that main character and just enjoy it. Like I think that's probably one of the
yeah,
reasons it was so successful because it doesn't require any background info about Japan or anything like that to enjoy it, right?
yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it wasn't like any kind of deep connection to Japan or anything like that. You just kind of had maybe in the back of your mind some enjoyment that you had of the games, maybe a little bit of like the culture, but you didn't even realize that it was necessarily Japanese per se. And then, so I guess at some point you got into design and
hmm
UX before you started the software development side of things. So can you talk a little bit about how you got, I guess, interested in the concept of like design?
Yeah. So like the real truth of it is that I always wanted to do software development, but
Hmm.
back in the day, so this is about the year like 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
This was like when Mac OS 10 was brand new and coming out, and I was really excited to try to develop for this platform. I don't know, 13 or 14. I was pretty young.
Okay.
But unlike now, it was like the internet existed, but it wasn't full of like insane amounts of tutorials and videos and how-tos on how to get started programming. So
Hmm.
it was sort of like I got a book called
Hmm.
Cocoa Development,
Right.
and like by the time I started, the book was already out of date. Like the development tools had changed so much that I couldn't even follow the tutorials. So I kind of like just put it on the back burner and did the next best thing, which was I applied to university for industrial design. And that's a great program. I highly recommend anyone study industrial design, especially or any design program,
Hmm.
because I really think like the a design program helps you really think about problem solving,
Hmm.
which has basically helped me through every job I've had. Like,
Hmm.
how do you really compartmentalize a problem into solvable chunks? That's like the vast majority of design school.
Hmm.
And there's different ways of doing it. Like the most common one is like human-centered design, but there's like several others.
Hmm.
So I really think that set me up for the rest of my career. So I'm very happy I did that.
Hmm.
Obviously, the industrial part I never used. Like that's mostly, back in university, we would talk about like, oh, you have to move to Taiwan, basically, if you want to do the actual industrial design work,
Hmm.
because like the people making hardware are all in Taiwan or China or wherever.
Wow.
So yeah, it seemed kind of far off, but I just converted it into UX, which is like sort of the digital version of industrial design. Yeah.
Wow. So you had this idea that you wanted to study software development at some point, but it wasn't quite as accessible to kind of get into. And maybe in particular, you wanted to maybe study in Mac OS
Hmm.
development. And so you seem to have a pretty big interest in Apple. And I also noticed that maybe your first, I guess, foray into the tech world was actually with Apple, but it was on the retail side
Oh
as
yeah, that's true.
a genius. Is that right? Like during
Yeah,
university, I
yeah.
think. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great, great college job,
Mm.
because it was very well paying for retail. Like I think at the time that was around about the iPhones came out. So like 2007, 2000, something like that. 2008, I was working
Ah.
there
Mm.
and I was making like $20 an hour.
It was a
And
lot
it
back
had,
then. Yeah.
yeah, it's a lot of money. Like I know the
Yeah.
minimum wage is like $15 an hour now, but back then the minimum wage is like $7, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
in California, and I was making 20, and it had extremely flexible hours because it's retail, so you could get the high pay and still work around your university schedule. So that was a great college job. I really enjoyed that job. Now if I need to take a computer apart, I can, no problem, take it apart.
Nice. So, did that deepen your affinity for maybe the Apple brand and like make you want to get into the development aspect as well?
I don't think so. I think I probably
Hmm.
joined Apple because I was already into it.
Okay.
So like I
Hmm.
got my first Mac, like I said, around 2001,
Hmm.
and always wanted to develop for that platform and always liked it. And there were like some like sort of rock star developers, if you could say, like Will Shipley and Cable Sasser. Some of these people, probably no
Ah,
one knows these people's names anymore. And they just seemed so cool, and I wanted to be like them. So that's kind of kept me going in the software development side or pursuing it. Yeah.
right. Well, I guess that dovetails well with your university degree in the industrial design because they're kind of like the epitome of industrial design, right? Or is that
For
not the
sure, for
case?
sure. Like,
Okay.
I mean, obviously, especially when I was going to university, like everyone was obsessed with Johnny Ive. Uh,
Right.
he was like the rock star after the guy
Yeah.
from Braun. That's
Uh,
the most famous designer before him.
right. Right. I see. So was he like an idol of yours then?
I mean, I think it would be kind of like presumptuous to say no, honestly. I think if there was any industrial designer that studied or in the era of like Apple becoming huge, I
Yeah.
think they'd be pretty presumptuous to say that like they didn't look up to Johnny Ive.
So then, once you graduated from university, you started working as a UX designer. So
Hmm.
I guess pretty related to what you were studying in school,
Hmm.
um, and you were in San Francisco at the time. So what was that first job like? Working as a UX designer in the SF kind of I guess tech scene.
Yeah, that was a really, really cool job. At that company, me and my coworker, we were hired at the same time. We were both relatively junior. Like the week we joined, our boss that hired us announced he was resigning. So
That's
we,
always fun.
yeah. So we got taken under the wing of like a great engineering manager. And actually, he was a Japanese American, but not related to coming to Japan at all.
Okay.
But yeah, his last name was Kao. And
Okay.
anyway, and so he was a really great engineering manager, but honestly, we were the only two designers in this huge engineering company. I think there were 1,000 people in R&D or more.
Wow.
And and so people really had no idea what to do with us. And so we sort of had to do a like, how to look at this stuff and how do we help? And so it led us down some pretty interesting avenues, but eventually we were able to show like, hey, the stuff we're doing and the questions we're asking are actually really valuable. And so they did start to grow the team. And the challenges we worked on were really hard because it was like an enterprise networking hardware company. Think
Right.
like Cisco or something, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
smaller, but
Mm-hmm.
similar idea where we were kind of working on like router interfaces. Like if you've ever configured your Linksys router,
Wow.
so like
Yes.
beauty, there is no concern over beauty, right? And so it's perfect for me because like again having that industrial design background
Mm.
and instead of like a visual design background, my visuals are not so strong. I can't draw. It really worked well because it's very technical. And like I was very proud one time where they were like, okay, we're going to redesign this feature if someone's
Mm.
interested. It's called QoS, quality of service,
Okay.
and it's like how you prioritize packets on the network. And
Okay.
I asked all these questions and did all this research and came up with this design about how you can like model this. And I presented it to the engineering manager who was leading the implementation of this update. He was so happy with it that he was like, I'm actually going to like readjust our database and everything to like fit this model because this model makes more sense than how we were modeling it in the software. So I
Wow.
was pretty happy with, to me, that's like real UX where it's like, it's not how it looks, but it's like how you model the thought around how it can be approached.
Wow. That's very interesting, and sounds like a very technical project where, like you said, it's not just like the visual design at all. You're
Mhm.
thinking about how to actually design the like kind of flow of information and things like that through the
Yeah,
system.
to me, that's UX. UX is
Ah,
like layout, information hierarchy, sort of how people approach the software and get through a task.
so that would be more like UI design is physically like,
Yeah,
okay,
and
give
and
maybe,
we do
yeah.
usually a UX team will have like a UX researcher that's like at the beginning of the process. They talk to the actual people using the software about the problems.
Uh-huh.
And then you have some UX designers to conceptualize the solution, and
Hmm.
then you have some visual designers to help polish the user interface. Doesn't always work like that, but that's sort of like a prototypical UX team.
Wow, that sounds like a really cool job.
Yeah,
And
it's a very
yeah.
good field. The problem is like most companies don't understand it, so it's very
Mhm.
hard to find a company that like does it well, I think.
Well, it also sounds like it would prepare you really well for a job as like a software developer as well, because you have to kind of think about similar things, like when you're designing systems and like you mentioned databases and that kind of thing. There's a lot of that kind of hierarchical thinking and different layers of abstraction and think about how the data moves through the back end to the front end and all that kind of thing. It matches pretty well with that too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think it's a good fit in computer science. There's a lot of concepts like the separation of concerns and other things like that, where if you have difficulty subdividing the problem, then you'll have difficulty like enacting those concepts.
Wow. So I think a lot of people probably have a dream of living and working in Silicon Valley slash San Francisco and like maybe the Bay Area. And you did it. Is it all it's cracked up to be, like in terms of the work life balance, maybe, and just like the vibe? What's it actually like, I guess, to work in tech in San Francisco, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, like everyone has their own preferences.
Mm,
So I was always like a city person. So for me, the issue with San Francisco is it's not big enough.
mm,
So that was one of my major reasons for wanting to relocate.
okay.
Um, that said, even to this day, I tell people like if you want to be like the best computer scientist and work with the best computer scientists and work on the most leading edge tech, like go to Silicon Valley.
Okay.
Like if that is your explicit goal, then do that.
Right.
It's just like I think that there's a lot of people where that's not there. In terms of working style, I was always sort of disappointed with it
Mm,
because I feel like it's California and I grew up in Southern California, so I'm like full
mm,
California my whole life until
okay.
Japan. We don't like working. And so that was my feeling of like most people I met was like the best thing about their job at Google or wherever was like, oh yeah, I know I can go in at 10 and leave at 6 and
Mm,
not really think about it. And then I can go to this bar and stuff like that.
Mm,
So it was like not area super motivated by work.
mm,
Now, maybe
mm,
again, if you're a leading edge ML researcher, I'm sure that's not the case for you right now,
mm.
given the stuff that's going on. But I think for most people doing most jobs, it was the thing that motivated them was not work. They wanted to go to Tahoe and go hiking and do all that kind of stuff.
I see. So you felt like maybe it wasn't the most stimulating work environment, but it was like great work-life balance.
Hmm.
So those rumors of the great work-life balance are true, right?
I think
In
the
your experience.
rumors of great work-life balance. I think the other thing to note though is I was lucky enough to sort of have graduated college, not during the loan crisis, right?
Mm,
During 2008. Like I was in school during that sort of like downturn.
mm, mm,
And then like the next tech bubble sort of was peaking when I was entering. And so like we saw that tech bubble burst in like 2022 or whatever when all the
mm.
layoffs started happening.
Right.
So I wonder if it's still like I'm saying now that
Mm.
the bubble has burst, things are harder. We just saw the Google CEO say like, "Hey, ML people, you actually might need to work 60 hours a week."
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, so like maybe it's changing now, but like
Mm,
in that sort of peak bubble time, 2015, 2016, 2017, it was like
mm.
a lot of pay and like not a lot of work.
Which some people would love, but not everyone, right? If you want a little bit more out of your career, that might actually not be the ideal situation, right?
Yeah, it might not be the ideal situation, especially if it's false, right? If it is like a
Mm,
bubble and
mm.
then you wake up, the bubble bursts and you wake up and you realize, oh crap, like my skills are not as valuable as I thought they were.
Interesting. Do you think that's happening a bit right now,
I
based
think
on
that's
what you've seen?
happening a bit right now. Yeah.
Mm,
I
yeah.
think people are realizing, oh, the fact that I can make like a mobile app is not worth $175,000 a year or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, now with the rise of vibe coding, I think everyone's jobs might be potentially at risk. I don't
Yeah.
know if you've been
Yeah.
following
I
this
mean,
on Twitter or wherever, but
yeah,
yeah.
like we were writing some notes earlier, but I do think that the reason I could jump from UX into
Mm,
software development just by learning by myself is because in the years from Mac OS 10 coming out to the
mm,
iPhone, development had gotten so much easier because the abstractions had gotten better. Like
mm,
back in the day, you had to do the memory management and all this other stuff. So, as programming gets easier, and now as the AI comes along, I feel like the skills you need are more like the skills of a real practitioner, whether it be like a dentist or a doctor or a designer or whatever. And then you
mm,
just have to learn enough computer stuff to be able to offer your skills in a
mm.
digital way. So, anyway, that's kind of abstract, but I do think that's where we're going for most software development jobs.
As you've watched the AI take hold and become more and more of a factor in software engineering, has it made you feel kind of vindicated about your background being a bit more varied? And you know what I mean? Like starting out with like UX and actually studying that separately and then jumping into software engineering a bit later, trying, you've done various things where you did like product management and
Hmm.
engineering and engineering management, all those things. Are you glad now looking back that like, oh yeah, thank God I had learned all those other skills and didn't just focus 100% on software engineering the whole time?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I do think all the AI stuff is interesting. I do use ChatGPT all the time now,
Mm,
especially if I'm approaching like a new language,
right.
where like the concepts are all the same, but the syntax or something is different. Then ChatGPT will easily give me like, here's the Python way of doing this thing,
Mm.
which is really handy. But if I had to do it all over, I think I would just study computer science.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, because like now I'm in a position where I don't feel like I will ever be like a great software engineer, like
Mm,
really strong,
mm.
like algorithms and sort of the lower level stuff. I'm just not very good at, and they're not interesting to me, so I don't force myself to learn them. I don't want to say like for sure I regret it or something like that, but if I had to start over, I would probably try to go straight into computer science.
That's actually kind of surprising. Because personally, I feel like there's computer science and then there's computer engineering.
Yeah.
And I think they're actually very different things, personally. You
Yeah.
can, I think you can be a great software engineer without being a great computer scientist, and potentially vice versa. Of course, knowing computer science I think helps, but it's only
Yeah.
really one small part of all the different things that encompass software engineering.
Yeah, let me reflect on my reflection. I'm computer engineering. Actually, I've heard some people say this, and I think it's starting to really be true, or I'm really
Mm,
starting to believe it. But I've heard people say, sort of half not jokingly, that any university degree that ends in science is not a science. So, like, I think
right.
there's like political science. And there's those types of degrees where it's like, that's not a science. And I feel like you're kind of getting at that point, which is like computer science is also not a science.
Yeah, I think it's a fair argument to make, you know.
Yeah.
But I guess at some point you had this desire from way back to get into development, and you made it happen. You were working for a
Yeah.
few years in SF as the UX designer, and at some point you were able to make that transition. So can you talk a little bit about how you actually made that happen?
Yeah, so when I started working at this company as the UX designer,
Hmm.
like I said, we had good work-life balance. So I would literally go home and like learn programming on my own.
Hmm.
So I did start with like one free class. This is probably one of the benefits of being in San Francisco was there's just tons of free resources for computer stuff, right? Tons of
Hmm.
meetups, tons of classes. So I took this one free class on getting started with iOS development. And that got me up and rolling. And from there is a very painful process of like trying to put together my own app idea. Eventually got to the point where people I was meeting at these meetups, I was able to sort of convince one of them that, oh yeah, I'm learning how to do this stuff. And, eventually convinced him to let me work for him. And so that was how I've got my official first job. It was kind of poor timing because, like I said, I think in that bubble time, I was getting paid like too much money. And so there was a certain point where I was like, oh man, I'm kind of sick of San Francisco and I have all this money I don't know what to do with. So it's like either buy a house or go travel. So I went with my partner at the time and we traveled for 10 months. So I could only work for this company for like 4 months. It was very interesting. It was like a very tiny startup. There were, I don't know, six of us in this big warehouse thing. Yeah, it was a very good experience.
So that, I guess, would get you used to some of the day-to-day realities of being a software developer with, I'm guessing you were doing like code review and working with like GitHub and all that, pull
Yeah.
requests and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, luckily because I came up kind of late in the process, I always had GitHub like that. Even from
Really?
the getting started, the first class, they're like, here's GitHub, create an account,
Nice.
here's how you put your thing in it. So that I didn't have to transition through. Although like you have to learn more advanced Git, I suppose, once you're actually working with other people.
That's cool. You said it was an in-person class?
Yeah, like and it was just a free like getting started with iOS development class, or
Wow.
maybe it wasn't free, maybe it was like $30 or something.
Hmm.
But these kinds of things were happening all the time in San Francisco, I remember. So there were a lot of resources. I used to help teach at like it wasn't women who code, but it was like a similar type of group for the same
Wow.
thing. So there was all sorts of resources available. Yeah.
Wow. So you did the class and then got more involved in kind of the community there. Ended
Hmm.
up finding someone at an event that gave you, kind of a chance on you, and you're able to get that first developer job. But then, after only a few months, you decided to move on and actually travel. So you said 10 months. This was like worldwide. Like, where all did you
Yeah,
go? Yeah.
I went to Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, and then
Wow.
switched over to Asia and went to Korea, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia.
Sounds like a good trip. So, so you were like doing like a couple months in each place kind of thing, like
Yeah,
slow
exactly.
travel?
So it depends on where you were. So like Japan was the shortest because it's the most expensive.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And then like Thailand and Vietnam are the longest because they're the cheapest.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
So yeah. Mexico is also a great place.
But I'm guessing that something must have really stuck out to you about Japan during that
Mm.
time, and that maybe that was when you decided that you would want to live here for a longer period of time. Like, how did that actually come about?
Yeah, so that actually did happen. So for work at that my first tech company was a UX designer. I
Hmm.
did go to Singapore for a work trip. That
Mm.
was like my first time in Asia. But yeah, like my one of the coworkers, he was like, "Oh yeah, Singapore's great first Asian country because it's like only half Asian." You know?
Yeah.
And so like you go there and it was a really good trip, very interesting. And but yeah, it's like everything's in English. It's so easy to get around. Everything's
Right.
clean and nice and safe. And so that was my first exposure to Asia. But then on this world trip, I went to Korea for the Winter Olympics. So was that 2017? And I was, I had no idea what to expect, but all I had in my mind was like initial D, which is Japanese. So it's not even, it's like, I don't know, is it going to be like that in Seoul? I have
Right.
no idea. It wasn't like that. And I remember just feeling kind of like let down by Seoul, like it wasn't my
Mm.
place. I wasn't feeling it. But then after that, I went to Tokyo for the Try Swift conference. And it was something enchanted me about this place. Still blown away. Like every time I step outside my door and like walk around and look up and stuff, I'm just like, man, this place is so cool. Yeah, there's something about it. I don't know what captures me.
I think initially being enchanted by it is one thing, but now 6 years later, still being enchanted, that's impressive.
Yeah.
Because that's not always the case. Some people, they kind of novelty wears off, but you still feel like very happy to be in Japan even now.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, like it gets so far, it gets worse every year in terms of. I remember after the pandemic, I went back to America for the first time since 2019. I was in Japan already for like 3 or 4 years
Wow.
away from America, right? And so I remember I had the absolute worst reverse culture shock. Like
Really?
literally immediately when I landed and was like trying to get out of the airport, I was like, "Oh my God, like get me out of here," you know?
Okay. What specifically was it about like the US culture that you ran into that caused that, would you say?
It's just like everything is just a mess and everything is so chaotic and like no
Right.
one has any idea what they're doing. And I totally forgot. I forgot like, oh yeah, all the bathrooms are dirty. Just use the bathroom at home. Like, that kind of
Uh,
stuff. I just forgot all this stuff. And so
right.
when I arrived back, I was like, oh my God, like these people are just like everywhere. They're just running around with their heads cut off, like chickens.
Wow. Yeah, because Japan is obviously very orderly, very
Yeah.
clean. People follow the rules. So I could definitely see that contrast after 3 years being a bit alarming.
I think the thing that still gets me the most when I go back is like people just don't really know how to do their jobs and they're not really
Mm,
interested in trying. And that bothers me somehow. Like, I feel like the really beneficial part of the work culture in Japan is
mm,
like everyone's like proud of their work and
mm,
like tries to do it well. And there's no like, oh, you have a shit job or you're just a janitor or this kind of stuff. Like everyone is like so like proud of their work and wants to do it well. And
hmm.
so it's very infectious, right? It spreads to you as well. So
Yeah.
you're like, no, 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 I can't let people down. I have to like get this right. And it's very strange. Yeah, but I like it. And I do remember one distinct experience when I was working at Mercari, which we'll probably get into soon. But one of my coworkers who was English, and I was used to
Mm,
English people complaining all the time, so it wasn't a big deal. But he was complaining
right.
like, "Look at all these people; they have these pointless jobs. Like the person doing the
Yeah,
construction, the lights, and
I
the
do.
person at the top of the escalator cleaning the handrail thing." And I didn't really think of it at the time. I just, I was literally fresh off the boat. And,
Mm,
but then when I went back to the US, that first culture shock, those people have the most important jobs. I wish America had someone cleaning the handrails of the escalator. And all these salarymen working in front of the computer, they can just jump out the window as long as we still have the people directing traffic at the construction and the person cleaning the escalator, then we'll still have, nice stuff.
that's a really good point because I've run into similar kind of complaints from people, and it's like, does it really take so many people to do this whatever construction job or whatever?
Yeah.
And it's like the implication I think is that like, oh yeah, back in America we just automate this. We just have systems that do this. We don't need people for it. But it's like, are there actually systems doing it though, or is it just
No,
not done? Yeah,
it's just
exactly.
not done. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. It's just a big
The
mess, right?
right. Like whatever escalator handrails are just dirty.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly, exactly. So it's like, yeah, I really got that sense of like, no, 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 like all these jobs are important and everyone should do their job well, and it makes everything nicer.
It does. It does. I totally agree with that. That's good that you kind of still feel that way, even 6 years into your journey here. But let's jump back real quick to talk a little bit about how you maybe found that first job in Japan. So you were traveling, you really loved Japan, you decided maybe I want to stay here for a bit longer, try working here. So then did you go back to the US and then apply for jobs from there? Or how did you actually find this first job at Mercari?
Yeah, so I timed my visit to Japan for the TriSwift conference, which is actually, I was told that this is the biggest Apple developer conference outside of WWDC, which is the official Apple one.
Wow.
So it's pretty big conference. And I went there at Tim, who we know,
Nice.
because I knew him from San Francisco, and he had moved to Mercari as well. So he introduced me to some Mercari people, and we went out to dinner, and they were like, yeah, once you finish your travel, just apply. We'll, go from there. And so then I left and continued traveling for a couple more months to Southeast Asia, and then went back home and stayed with my parents while I was applying for jobs. And like I said, I wanted to move to a bigger cities. I had 3 critical job interviews, one in Boston, but Boston, no thanks. And then one in New York, which was I'll just say it was at Capital One. That was an extremely good interview, an extremely good job opportunity. They gave me an offer, and then one at Mercari. Now the Mercari one they did fully remote, which I don't know if that was normal or if it was because they already met me at the conference. But before the pandemic, it was not normal to do remote interviews, I feel like. For New York, they flew me out, and Boston, they flew me out. Yeah, so I had this really difficult choice between New York, Capital One, or Mercari in Japan, and it was really hard to choose. Probably for my career, it would have been better to go to Capital One. But I was sort of enchanted by Tokyo when I went there. And also when I went to New York for the interview, I stayed one extra day to be a tourist. And I had really forgotten just, again, how loud and dirty that city is and how rude everyone is. And I was like, oh, I should go. I'm from California. We're not in your face people. So I think it's a little difficult culture shock. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go to a place with nicer people than California. So I decided to go to Japan.
Wow.
Yeah.
So decision was between Capital One and New York, or Mercari and Japan, and Tokyo. So would you say that was mostly the city that ended up being the decider, or was it mostly the company?
I think it was mostly the city.
I mean, some similarities, but actually 2 very different cities. Yeah, I could see how it would be appealing. There's this dream of living in Tokyo, right? It's a little bit more exotic, a little bit of a different kind of path, I guess, than trying to move to New York. But you said that maybe for your career, just staying in the US and going to New York and Capital One maybe would have been better. Is that mainly because the compensation is higher there, or there are just more opportunities, or what is it about New York that you think maybe would have actually been better career-wise?
Yeah, I think New York is not like Silicon Valley where there's infinite opportunities, but I feel like there's still a really big, strong tech ecosystem there. And again, I think that the value placed on software development in general is probably higher. I don't want to try to stereotype Japan too much, but I feel like in New York you have big companies like Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, all Google, all have big New York offices. So I think that it sort of would have ended up I could have a very traditional software developer job and grow my skills in one role, which I think there's different trade-offs, but I think the Japan working style is not so specialized where you can do that. So I feel like in the US, we're very good at honing one skill and then dividing the work up into people that have different skills. Whereas in Japan, they prefer people that are more rounded, and they will often switch into different roles just because oh my God, there's a fire over there. Just go do this other thing, even though it's not related to your skill set.
It is interesting how Japan does that. Even the new grad Shinsetsu hiring system that they have here is more about just getting a bunch of people in to the company, and then once they're there, you kind of figure out what each person's going to do based on the priorities of the company, rather
Yeah.
than like, oh, this person is a specialist in iOS development, therefore we have to find an iOS position for them. It's more just
Yeah.
like, we want you as a person and then we'll figure it out later kind of thing. And
Yeah,
yeah.
which is good and bad. So like I have coworkers that worked at Toyota in the past, and
Mm,
like they say they're, every 3 years well, basically they have a very sophisticated skill, like they call it competency management system. It has a database of all the skills of all the employees, and every
okay.
3 years they'll be like, oh yeah, you're a little weak in this area, so go work in that department, and they'll just move you. And so it's like it's very interesting because you get very well rounded and you can see the perspectives of the rest of the company and your other
Mm.
teammates. But it does make it hard to really specialize.
So yeah, because that is like kind of the traditional way of doing it, and I think it's still practiced at a lot of the bigger Japanese companies as
Hmm.
well. But Mercari is a bit different. It's more of like a modern company that's more modeled after like the Silicon Valley
Hmm.
style startups. So I'm curious, like, was there much difference between SF and the work culture at Mercari, or was it more just like more of the same because it really was similar to what you experienced in SF?
No, and actually, I would say they were so similar
Mm.
because the companies I worked at were also in similar positions. So the company I worked at in San Francisco was in the same position where they had this one really successful product and it completely saturated the market, and they were trying to branch into other products, but could never really escape that they were the company that made the original successful product. So they had the same situation where it was okay, we gotta acquire this thing, figure out this market, adapt our product to be more in this new market that it doesn't serve right now.
Right.
So it was, I don't want to say desperate, that's not the right word, they weren't desperate, but they were really trying to diversify, and it was
Mm.
very difficult, right? And I think Mercari is pretty similar.
Mm.
Like they have their very successful, I don't want to say flea market
Marketplace
app
app.
because in
Yeah.
yeah, marketplace, because in English flea market doesn't mean anything uh, anymore.
Not really. Yeah.
Uh, but in Japanese, they call it a flea market app for some reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, like this marketplace app, very successful. It's like basically saturated the entire country. Like if
Yeah.
you take out the number of people that are children and the number of people over 65, it's basically like more than half the country uses the app. And so it's
Right.
completely saturated. So they're trying to like branch into other areas. And so
Mm.
it really felt very similar to
Mm.
Silicon Valley when I was there.
And so you started as an iOS developer, and would you say that you were using the same tech stack within iOS development that you would have been if you'd been in somewhere like the US? Or was it like different because you're in Japan?
Yeah, so like again, I only had the 4 month experience at that one startup, and so
Right.
it's hard to say for sure. And like definitely the networking company I worked at, they didn't have any mobile stuff or any client software at all, really. So it's hard for me to say, but like at the little startup, we were using completely vanilla iOS. So I would say Mercari was way more sophisticated, right?
Mm.
Because they had pioneering architecture
Mm.
by one of the lead engineers, and they had like fantastic CI. And we had like a Slack bot to test and release the new version of the app. So to me it felt very sophisticated.
I would agree. I don't think that being in Japan, as long as you're at like a more modern company like a Mercari,
Hmm.
I don't think it holds you back technically, personally.
No, no.
There may be fewer options and you have to be a little bit more careful when kind of choosing where you work. Whereas in Silicon Valley, probably the baseline is higher, so you can kind of find that type of environment in a lot more places. But as long as
Hmm.
you make your way to, one of these kind of Silicon Valley style Japanese startups, or like obviously a gaishike, like a foreign company, then I think it's going to be pretty similar, don't you?
I think the main limitation, especially if you're like doing mobile development, I think at this point, most mobile development is sort of like re-implementing a really bad web browser. So I don't know how much mobile you've done, but like
Uh,
most apps you use are just downloading like a JSON payload and then rendering it in the screen,
yeah, that's
right?
really
So
interesting.
like
Yeah.
so the amount of how much skill you need to do that I think has a limit unless you're working at like some insane scale, which I sort of don't believe because it's the client, right?
Mm,
So there's no scaling issue. The only scaling issue is you want to do like too much analytics, so it's slowing down or
mm,
something. But yeah, I
right.
do think there is a problem in the clients, the mobile software industry, where I just don't know, why can't we just build a web page
Right.
for this app? For this app.
So you feel like this is occurring both overseas and in Japan,
Yeah,
right?
this is not a Japan thing. This is just in general. Like, I know that you can provide a slightly better experience or something, but it's like getting so small at this point that I do wonder. For me, it's like, why is the Facebook app 400 megabytes? That's sort of my how I think about it. And it's because it's like, okay, you've put a lot of resources into building a really not so great version of Chrome. Maybe that's my hot take for the interview, but
So
I was getting a little bored of mobile development, I guess is end of the
I see.
story.
Right. So do you think you'd be less likely to maybe recommend that someone else go into mobile development because of this? Or yeah, I mean, would you maybe recommend that they do something like specialize in like React Native or like Flutter or one of those kind of tools that allow you to build the front end all as one kind of code base? Or what do you think is the solution?
Yeah, that's really hard to say. So, like, I think when you're doing it yourself, like, you
Hmm.
obviously benefit from building the back end and the front end. And
You're
I
right.
would say
Yeah.
use the technologies that are appropriate. Unfortunately, like, there's just business reasons why mobile development is like the way it is now because
Hmm.
the apps are so preferred over websites in terms of access to the user. And Apple has made it that way on purpose. But especially when you're starting out, I would definitely recommend thinking of your application as, to get like corporate speak, but like as a solution. And a solution is not a technology, right? So if you need to build the back end in JavaScript and the front end in Swift or whatever, then do that. But if you can do it just like with web technologies, then you should do that. So I think that'll give you more, at least for the getting started, it'll give you more experience and more flexibility. I think companies do value that being able to know, having an inclination, if you're a front end person, about how the back end person is going to feel about your request or vice versa.
I see. So you would recommend maybe trying to be a bit more full stack, at least make sure you understand what's going on in the back end as well and don't just go all in on front end kind of thing.
Yeah. And like, also knowing some of the pitfalls of like the back end side. So I remember uh just to like F with our back end person while we were developing this feature, I
Uh-huh.
changed my phone into the Japanese calendar mode, which is not the default, even in Japan. And then I clicked the button that would send the date of the request, to the server. It was Heisei 1 because I moved here in 2019. And so he literally got a year value of 1 in the backend server and accepted it with no error. And I was like, I think you have a bug.
Wow, it's funny that you can mess with people on the back end and kind of
Yeah.
create these
Pro tip
bugs and
for
stuff.
the Apple developers out there: if you're
Uh,
sending dates to the server, do not use default calendar.
yeah, I mean, was the language barrier an issue at all when you were trying to, get used to working at Mercari, or did they just have enough support and everything where it was not an issue?
Yeah, so I really, really, really think that if you are wanting to relocate to Japan, like obviously I don't have any other experiences, but I
Mm,
felt like Mercari, I don't see how you could have a better experience relocating than with Mercari. Like I now work at a different company, and I know the people relocating now do not have as good of an experience as Mercari gives you.
mm,
And it's not just like financial, because like every
mm,
company will like probably move your stuff and they'll probably rent you a place for one month or 2 months to find an
mm,
apartment. But like Mercari had just one, they had the translation and interpretation team. So at any
mm,
time for any meeting, you could schedule. And they had amazing support for overseas people. I feel like that first year, I went to every single Japanese festival just because it was organized by people at Mercari. And so I went to like all the fireworks, I went to the cherry blossom stuff and
mm.
all that kind of stuff, all the first year, like Obon holiday things. And so
Uh,
it was just like the best experience I could imagine for someone coming to Japan because, if you just come here and you're all alone, it's very hard to do more than just sort of randomly walk around, you know?
right. So they helped out with all the relocation, and you didn't have any like major issues with that. I mean, I know that finding an apartment, getting that first bank account open, and everything can be a big stumbling block for a lot of people. But was that not an issue for you?
Yeah, so I do remember I did ask around to other software engineers that had moved, relocated, like which sort of apartment finding agency did you use? Now,
Mm.
obviously, like in San Francisco, we would all use like Craigslist,
Mm.
which is a much more like hands-on approach. So here I just like, okay, well, it'll probably be more money, but I'll use this agent. And they fully supported English. So they even took pictures of the control panels in the new apartment you got and then like annotated them in English and sent you like PDFs.
Wow.
So it was like a full service kind of deal. And I
Mm.
always lived in big corporate apartment. I do know some people have stories of like having difficulty finding places as a foreigner, but like I
Mm.
never, it was always like paperwork. There was no
Mm.
person involved at all, right? So
Mm.
never had any problems there. And in terms of the bank, everyone sets you up at SMBC Prestia because they speak English, which
Right.
is fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that bank. I've had no problems. But if people are watching this and considering, the only thing about that bank is it's not a normal bank. Apparently, the only reason they speak English is because they used to be Citibank, and it was like Citibank, like investment version of it. And so then SMBC bought it. And so it's still an investment bank. So, like, when you do normal apps and things, they never support it because it's not a regular bank. So that's the only thing to keep in mind. But they do speak English. So it's like very, very easy. I also like they give reasonable home loans if you don't have permanent residency. So like I bought
Yeah.
my apartment that way as well.
Wow. That's awesome. And you can always get another bank account at one of the big, whatever, mega
Yeah.
banks once you're more
Yeah,
established.
once you're more established, you can get a regular bank account at a regular bank, and
Mm.
so I have that as well. The banking here is extremely cheap, so I don't think anyone charges fees for anything. So
Yeah.
it's not like the US where you're like, oh, you have to maintain a balance of, $10,000 or else we charge you $50 a month and blah blah.
Right.
There's none of that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that it was a smooth process for you. So then I guess you worked for a while at Mercari as an iOS developer. And then at some point you actually switched over to being an engineering manager. Is that right?
Hmm.
So how did that kind of come about, I guess? And then how did that go?
Yeah, so I can't remember the exact reasons, but I think I remember making a pitch to my manager at the time that like, man, I see like a lot of like unhappy people around me complaining all the time. So maybe
Yeah.
if I become engineering manager, I can help resolve this issue. Unfortunately, there's no like sort of, or, at least when I was switching, there was no like, okay, all new managers take this class on management sort of thing. And
Right.
also, right about that time is when the pandemic started. And so it was really bad time to be like a new, inexperienced manager, like being fully remote
Mm.
and trying to like help people with problems. I think it also depends on the company structure because I don't know how it is now, but there's different ways where sometimes the manager is the person that gives you your work, and sometimes the manager is just someone that like supports you. And at the time, Mercari was like someone that the second option. So the current company I'm at, it's the first option. So the manager gives you your work.
Mm.
I can see the pros and cons of both systems, but like the con of the manager not giving you your work is that when you have problems with your work, there's very little the manager can do about it because they didn't assign
Right.
you the work, right? And
I see.
so that was also a problem, I thought. Like that made it
Mm.
very difficult to respond to situations because you couldn't just say, "Oh yeah, I can see you're overworked, so let me just either take that task from you or like give it to someone else or whatever."
Mm.
That
Mm.
would make it much easier to manage, right? And so that was one of the major problems I felt I had.
So you felt kind of helpless, like you saw a problem that, someone under you was facing and you were unable to kind of help them, right?
Yeah, the only thing you could do is sort of like talk to the other person that is giving them that work, which was usually a product manager, if I remember
Okay.
correctly, and then
Mm.
try to sort it out. But like, yeah, sometimes these engineer product manager arguments were pretty unreasonable, in my opinion.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, I think in Japan, maybe there might be a little bit of a difference in terms of like the power structure between engineering and product.
Mhm.
And did you run into that at all where you felt like engineering kind of worked for the product side and they were above you guys as engineers? Or like, was that not an issue?
I don't think this is like a Japan issue.
Oh, okay.
Like we had the exact same product management versus engineering arguments at the well, actually we had it like UX versus product
Mm.
management at the when I was a UX designer.
Mm.
But at the end of the day, I don't think most companies exist to like create like beautiful source code. So does get annoying to me, like when I can get a little annoyed when engineers are like, oh, I don't want to implement this feature because it's annoying for users. It's like, I agree, but like probably someone else has considered that, which is why they asked for the feature, you know?
Right.
And so maybe I'm a bad engineer in that way, in that don't have much sympathy for that kind of stuff. But like, I do understand, like, obviously, if you're building a lot of technical debt, those things have to be considered, right? So
Mm.
it's not like product managers should always win, but in general, the feature is meant to like enable some business use case that does not involve like the opinions of the software engineers.
I see. And that's really interesting because this leads into your next role because you did change jobs and you're working now in the automotive industry, but at like a very cutting edge technical role there. But you're a product manager now. So you've seen
Yeah.
both sides. I feel like engineering manager is kind of like in the middle between the two because you're talking to product managers a lot more maybe than you would be as just like an individual contributor engineer. So you've kind of seen it from both sides, and it sounds like that's given you like a lot of appreciation for the need to fulfill the business needs rather than be just kind of off doing your own thing as an engineer working on your own feature or whatever. Like, would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, so like I haven't actually updated my LinkedIn, so you haven't actually seen. So basically, joined as a product manager, but as times have changed about 2 years ago, I changed to the quality team. So I can talk a little bit about both, but like being product manager, I'll be honest, the reason I switched to product management is because maybe I got to this a little bit earlier, but like the jobs that this company was hiring for were
Mm.
so technical, right? So like the engineering jobs they were hiring for was like machine learning, computer
Mm.
vision,
Wow.
geolocation, all this sort of stuff. And I was like, this is beyond my skill set as a meager iOS developer. So since I had the UX background, I was like, well, I could probably pass off as a product manager. And
I
so I
see.
did the interviews, and it was basically my way into the company. And it was actually true for a lot of the product managers at the time. And so our manager at the time, he did hire sort of a consultant to do a lot of like training on what it means to do product management, because we also were stuck in that situation similar to a lot of UX designers
Mm.
where we weren't really product managers. We were more like product owners
Mm.
in the Scrum team,
Okay.
which to someone not familiar with how all this stuff works sounds similar because they have product in the name, but they're not the same.
Right.
Just like the UX and the visual designers, right? So like they run into
Yeah.
the same situation. So with this, so I had no problem doing the product owner stuff because that's
Mm.
just like Scrum, which is like very easy. Then to actually do product management and to try to create like value for customers, I learned a lot from this guy. And since we had this sort of major automotive partner in Japan, we also had to sort of navigate this insanely complex other company from the outside without speaking much Japanese. And that was also a very challenging process, but it was like pretty rewarding. So, like, basically, I would say I did get to the point where I started to understand like the problems that needed to be solved.
Okay.
Some of them, not all, obviously, not all of them, but like a
Mm.
few, some
Mm.
problems that could be solved, right?
Right.
And so it was a very interesting and challenging experience. Yeah, it's different in enterprise versus consumer. So like my first company was enterprise as well. So I did enterprise versus consumer is like very different. And
Mm.
so my first company was also enterprise. So I was used to this situation, and I actually much prefer enterprise because
Mm.
it's like you can actually just like go to your customer and ask them what the problems are, and
Mm.
they actually have sort of like the ability to tell you.
Mm.
Whereas like consumer, it's a lot more like A/B testing, move this slider around, see if the KPIs turn out, etc. So it's like much more personal in enterprise, which I enjoy. But yeah, it was a very interesting and challenging role for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And you mentioned something very interesting to me, which is that you basically prioritized the company over the role. And I've heard this from a few different people, actually, where it was, oh, actually, I wanted to do mobile development, but I looked at the companies hiring that could pay what I wanted to earn and had the environment that I wanted to be in. And it was such a small set of companies that I really had to switch to just doing backend, or I had to switch to doing
Mhm.
product management. I think that's actually a common story in Japan. And I guess it speaks to the fact that there aren't as many options. Would you say that that was part of, like, do you think if you were back in Silicon Valley, you would have ended up doing a role like this, or would you still be back on like the development side, do you think?
Well, I don't know if it's like a unique Japanese thing. I think like in Silicon Valley is very much the same. It was like, oh yeah, I want to work at Google because they have like free lunch. I mean, like, and they have bicycles on campus. And so I do feel like it is pretty common to want to choose the company because of the like quote unquote like lifestyle they offer.
Right.
I never worked at Apple corporate, but like
Mm.
they also are known for a quite unique thing, which is like not like Google, right?
Mm.
It's like, no, we won't do your laundry for you. You have to actually
Mm.
like work, you know?
Right.
And so like I think people join because of that. So I do think that in general, I mean, maybe I guess unless you're working on the most leading edge, highest tech stuff, you're probably going to choose the company based on
Mm.
their sort of perceived lifestyle instead of the work you're actually doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, yeah, you're right. It's probably not a Japan specific thing. But yeah, that's cool. I mean, you've landed at some really great companies, I think.
Mm.
It sounds like you've been able to maintain like a very Silicon Valley style kind of work environment despite being here in Tokyo. And you haven't really had to do overtime or anything like that, have you?
I think it's like any job.
Mm.
So like I do work more than in Silicon Valley, right? And I think that's like a side effect of what I said, which is like everyone wants to do good work. So you just end up working more at Mercari, especially, like a lot of people worked pretty late there, but it's not because they were like forced to. Their managers weren't yelling at them. There's just
Mm.
like they were just there having fun and they would like get out a beer or whatever and continue working. And then we would go out and get drinks after or whatever. So yeah, I do work more, but it's like the work is enjoyable and no one's forcing me. So,
Mm.
like today, I left at 4 p.m. so I could do this call, right? And like, my manager is not screaming at me.
That's awesome. That's a great example as well. Would you say that Tokyo delivered the kind of culture that you were looking for? Because I mean, you mentioned that you wanted to get out of Silicon Valley partly because of that culture of like just having super great work-life balance, but as a result, maybe not being as focused on work and career progression and stuff like that. Do you think
Mhm.
Tokyo delivered on that?
I think what Tokyo delivers on is that it is a great way or a great place to build a very comfortable life. So it's like hard to explain, but like it's very stable and you don't get paid as much as in Silicon Valley, but in general as the US. But all the costs are much, much, much lower. And so I was actually talking to another coworker about this the other day who's also from San Francisco
Mm.
and I was like, would you consider moving back to San Francisco? And he was like, I would consider it, but only if I made at least $1 million. And I was
Right.
like, that's exactly what I think, because to get the quality of life you have here making like maybe $100,000, like Senmanen, is like about the same as like $1 million in San Francisco in terms of like the food you can eat,
Uh-huh.
the things you can do, the ease with which you can do like travel destinations you can do, like onsen, like the hot springs trips and
Hmm.
travel and being able to buy a house. My uncle lived in Sunnyvale and he had a house that he bought in 1998 for
Nice.
300,000 ish dollars. He sold it right after the pandemic, 2023, for like $1.9 million,
Right.
right? And it's not a big house. It doesn't have a yard. It's like 70 years old. And if you convert that into yen, what is that like?
And 300 million
Like
yen, roughly.
three oku. And that's in Sunnyvale, not in San
Right.
Francisco. So you're not
Mm.
even in the city, right? And I'm in like the very center of Tokyo, 2 bedroom house. I mean, it's obviously smaller, but for like $500,000, right? Or
Yeah.
less, like what now with the weekend, right? And so
Right.
like the house is new, the interior is brand new.
Right.
Like I joked with one of my parents, if you ever open the fuse box in your house in San Francisco, or I'm not sure where you're from, but like,
Mm.
you open the fuse box and you're like, oh, is that a giant spider or is that just 10,000 little spiders, right? And like, and so I'm on the FaceTime call with my parents. And I'm like, look at this fuse box. And I open it and they're like, I don't know what that was. Never seen anything like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And so it's like automatic bath, which
Mm.
every apartment I've had has had, the washlet,
Mm.
obviously,
Yeah.
and everything's new. everything works. And so like these kinds of quality of life, like it has an elevator, my building has an elevator. Like, do you know how
Mm-hmm.
much an apartment with an elevator is in San Francisco? Any apartment? And
Yeah.
so like that's kind of what we're getting at with the $1 million. Like, you go for like pasta, with you and your partner, you each get a pasta, you each get a glass of wine. It's like $150 with tip, right? And
Right.
here you go, and that's like 3,000, 4,000 yen,
Yeah, exactly.
and it's better here. And so it's like that's how I think the quality of life is different. So it's like you won't have as much money.
Mm,
Buying Apple stuff is extremely painful, but like
yeah.
in terms of all the other normal life stuff you do, you really live a really nice life, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, it's true with the weekend, buying certain things has gotten kind of tough, but it still feels like a ridiculously good value, I think, being in Tokyo.
Hmm.
Like you said, you can buy a place for a reasonable amount. I mean, relative to places like San Francisco, at least. I mean, prices have gone up here too, but not nearly at the same
Yeah.
rate. So, yeah, I completely agree. That's awesome. So, you've been here 6 years. You mentioned you bought a place. So maybe you're planning to continue to be here for quite a
Yeah,
while.
yeah. So I did get my permanent residence. So I don't know if you
Congrats.
want to talk about that a little bit, but basically it's like not so hard. If basically the rules are like 10 years, right?
Right.
Right. If you don't have anything, but then there's like a points-based system. So if you
Hmm.
do come, look at the points-based system, you probably qualify for the 3-year version of it. So I did the 3-year version. So that was a bit of a process, but now I have my permanent residency. So I joke that I could like be homeless here now if I
That's
wanted.
right. No limitations.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
just don't commit any crimes. They'll still kick you out for crimes.
that is true.
But yeah, so that's pretty nice. I bought my place, so that's pretty nice. And so
Yeah.
yeah, planning to stay foreseeable future.
Okay.
Yeah, no other plans.
Yeah, I feel like that's how it usually is. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm going to be here for the rest of my life or whatever. It's like, yeah, no concrete plans to go anywhere else. I'm here for now.
Yeah.
And then you look back and like 10 years have gone by and then 20 years have
Yeah,
gone by or whatever.
exactly.
And it's
So
like, oh
like
yeah, I
I
guess,
think
yeah,
you do definitely get into that like situation of like stagnancy, which I don't think is a bad thing. Like
right.
again, I said this is a good place to build a stable life. I'm obviously after a stable life, so I
Mm.
don't consider stability to be stagnancy. But you definitely get into that situation. When I bought the place, my partner was like, "Do you feel comfortable dying here?"
Okay.
And I was like, "Yeah, I'd still be happy if I died here." Like
Wow.
it's like, yeah, well then it's probably a good house.
Yeah, I think so. That's, I mean, it's a tad morbid, but it's a good question, though. Anyways, I see that you are now actually also working on some, yeah, I guess, side projects, potentially side
Mhm.
businesses. I'm not sure if you've got them monetized or not, but is that because you have maybe some goal of potentially going out on your own, building a business at some
Mhm.
point, or are you just trying to keep your kind of tech skills up? Since you're doing the product management, like maybe some other not as tech focused positions, like you're trying to just be doing some more iOS development and things like that on the side, or like what's the story behind that?
Yeah, a lot of it is like I still want to keep up to date on skills. A lot of it is that because I have this skill set, when I start to experience some sort of problem that I need solving on my computer, like my default is just to like, oh, I'll build an app for that, right?
Uh,
And so that's another reason. So like actually on my Mac and my phone, 2 or 3 of the apps on each like or the dock or the home screen are like my own. And like
nice.
I don't it's like they don't do anything magical or unique. They just solve
Mm,
like this little tiny problem I had, right?
Those are
And
the best kind of
so
apps.
yeah, they're fun and it feels good to use your own stuff, which I think
Yeah.
you normally don't get to do. Like that's one of the cool things when you work at Mercari is like, you ride the train and you're like, oh, they're used like you can
Yeah.
see people literally on your app, right? And you're
Yeah.
like, oh, I made that, right? It's really cool feeling. And so yeah, like I don't have grand business ambitions. I'll be
Okay.
honest, I'm not much of an entrepreneur. Like I said,
Okay.
the stability is pretty valuable to me and running your own business is not that.
No.
As you know, running your
As
own
I know.
business. And so I do make the apps. Some of the apps do have like a tip jar.
Okay. That's
which
cool.
people occasionally put money in, but I would say it's never more than like $10 a month.
Okay.
So that's the main reason, is for keeping up to date on technologies, satisfying my own curiosity. And I do still like to be involved in the iOS community. For example, I'm going to try Swift. It's coming in April now, in like 3 weeks. And so I'm actually giving a small lightning talk there.
Wow.
So like I do like to just try to be involved still in the community.
Yeah, that's exciting. I mean, there's some cool looking apps. You've got one called Water Me, gardening reminders.
That one
I
is
don't know.
probably ready to retire. That one has been in development since like 2016.
Okay.
Still works. No problems with it. It has like, according to the Apple analytics, it's like 1,000 or 2,000 openings per month or something like that.
That's
So like
yeah.
it's not nobody, but it's like not big.
Right.
The problem with it is that the reminders app in iOS has gotten so good since then that
Mm,
I'm not sure it really adds any value over the reminders app.
I see.
So I would say that's the main problem.
So it sounds like you have built a pretty good, stable life here in Tokyo. Do you feel satisfied with like where you are, the company, with life in general, or is there anything else that you're still chasing that you feel like you haven't quite attained yet?
Pretty satisfied. Like I said, I don't have big ambitions to like become a millionaire and buy a jet and stuff like that. So like if those are your goals, like don't come to Japan. I would say like even the top CEOs don't get paid very much compared to
Yeah.
like in the US. Like I think
Mm,
there's literal like software engineers in Google that get paid more than like most, like the, for example, like the Honda CEO. I think if you like Google their actual pay, it's less than like really senior people at American companies. So
right.
definitely don't come here for riches. But
Mm,
in terms of life I enjoy day to day, I think I'm pretty satisfied. Like I was telling someone, asked me like why I like it here so much, and I think it goes back to like my earlier design, industrial design and all that stuff, but it's just like I just like everything just so. Like
uh,
when you go, when you go to a restaurant and they bring you your beer glass and it has like a
uh,
label for the brand of the beer company is on the glass, and they
yeah.
like turn the label towards you,
Yeah.
like that makes me so happy. Like, so maybe I have very low bar compared to other people that want like Ferraris and stuff, but like I'm so happy when they serve you the drink and it has like the label shown the correct orientation.
Right. They have a manual with all of the steps, and that's probably listed
Yeah, of
on.
course.
So
And you
it's
can see
written
them do it.
down.
They,
Yeah.
they have it on the thing and they like rotate it and then they're
Yeah.
like, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's always perfect. So I really, really like that stuff. It's hard to give up.
Things here tend to just work. There are a few exceptions here and there where you can get frustrated maybe at various points, but
Oh,
in
absolutely.
general,
I
like,
mean,
yeah.
so many frustrating, unspeakable number of frustrating situations, but I don't
Yeah.
think it's any different. I mean, it's definitely less than frustrating situations I had in America. And like at least
Mm,
I feel like all the frustrating situations I have here is because like I don't speak Japanese that well.
mm, mm,
So it's
mm,
like my fault.
mm.
But like, in the US, when you have a frustrating situation, it's like someone else just didn't do their job right,
Yeah.
which is always like very frustrating.
Right. Here, people tend to do their jobs well, and like you said, kind of take pride in doing it and doing things
Yeah.
well. So, yeah, it's
It's
cool.
been very rare that I've been like actually unsatisfied with the service provided or the product provided or whatever.
Mhm. So, I guess my question then would be, do you have any like tips or advice for someone who maybe wants to take a similar path and maybe work as an engineer or maybe a designer here in Japan? Like, is there anything that maybe you wish you had done a bit differently that you would maybe recommend someone else do, or any advice?
Yeah, I think this might be a common theme with your interviews, but definitely the language.
Mm,
Like, I definitely went into it. I didn't speak any or study at all before I moved here. And
mm,
then even after I moved here, I put it off for like 6 months or a year so I could get
mm,
settled, get focused on like getting up to speed with the job and getting settled, the apartment, all that stuff. But I think it's a really big mistake because honestly, like, unless you like studying languages, so you would like do it
mm,
for fun, which
right.
I know there's a lot of people that do. It's just like that's not me. And so coming home after work, after you worked like 8 or 9 hours, and then being like, okay, now I'm going to study Japanese. I mean, it's just like not happening.
Right.
So like it becomes very, very, very difficult to learn when you're working full time, in my opinion. And I would recommend for people looking to relocate, like at least get to, at least pass the N5 or the N4, the
Mm-hmm.
JLPT N5 or N4 before you arrive. I have now passed the N3,
Nice.
although I barely speak Japanese, so I feel like that is wrong. Like I should not have passed. Like when I did N5 and N4, I was like, no, I deserve to pass this. But then when I took N3, I was like, I don't deserve to pass this, but somehow I did. So I would at least recommend doing N5 or N4 before you arrive. Otherwise, it's really hard to get to that first level.
Yeah, I think it can be tempting to just say like, "Oh, I'm going to be surrounded by it all day once I'm there. Like, I don't need to
It
study
doesn't
before
work
leaving."
that way. I mean, again, maybe if you are really good at picking up languages, it can.
Yeah.
But again, that's just not me. So like I'm very visual, which is,
Mm,
part of my design background. So I really like studying the kanji because to me they're like a puzzle you put together. But like the actually wrote memorizing words and stuff like that is extremely tedious and boring for me. And it
mm,
takes me a really long time to remember them, even though I've been here like, yeah, 6 years studying actively for of those years. I'm
right.
still barely able to speak. And
Right.
it's because I'm not motivated. And like I work in English. I'm not
Yeah.
motivated because I don't enjoy studying it. And you get into your comfort zone, right? Where you can speak enough to interact with the people you need to interact with. And I'm kind of at that level. So it's hard to escape.
So I always tell people is like, make sure you hit the ground running because you alluded to this also. But if you take too much time to really start studying when you first arrive, then you can end up having the situation that you just described, where like you get into this bubble out of necessity because you don't speak it, and then but you get comfortable and you figure
Yeah.
out how to like get by without it, and then the need lessens more and more until you just are like, you know what, screw it. Actually, it turns out I actually don't even need it. But then,
Yeah, and
yeah.
and the other thing is like a lot of people said something along the lines of like, well, I really wanted to socialize with people, so that helped me like overcome the barriers.
Mm,
But if you're sort of like more of an introverted computer nerd
right.
like me, you actually don't feel the need to socialize, right? And so then it becomes like an excuse not to socialize. And so
Mm,
you can get into this spiral depending on your personality, right?
wow. Yeah, that's very true. So you mentioned that if you just like basically there are some people who maybe should not come to Japan. And it's you mentioned that it was basically the people who want Ferraris and to have millions of dollars and
Yeah.
basically earn as much as humanly possible. So would you say that that is the line of like if your goal is to just earn as much money as you can, as fast as you can, don't come to Japan? Or are there any kind of other aspects of it's like if you're this type of person, maybe just stay home, like maybe go to the US instead?
Yeah, I have seen people come in and sort of wash out, as it were. And I think it has to do a lot with how it's like I don't want to say like selfish or it's
Mm,
that's a too
hmm.
strong of a word, but it's like if you're very like I want all eyes on me kind of person, I think it can be
Mm,
very difficult here. Yeah, so if you really want to be noticed and you want to stand out and all this kind of stuff, I think Japan is a very difficult place to be. I mean, they have
mm,
that obviously very famous saying, which is like the opposite of every other country's version of that saying.
right.
Like, in America, we say like the squeaky wheel gets the grease,
Right.
which is like basically the annoying person gets helped,
Right.
right? And in Japan, they have the nail that sticks out gets hammered. So the annoying person gets hammered. And so, like, I think you will experience that if you are as sort of want to have eyes on you and want to
Mm,
stand out. I think Japan has very subtle ways of hammering you down.
I see. But you don't mind that.
I don't mind that. I always wanted to be
Right.
invisible, actually. So, like,
I see. So maybe if you're an introverted kind of person and you don't want to be the center of attention or whatever, then it can be a good fit. But if you want to like make a name for yourself, maybe become well known, whatever, do some personal branding and really build whatever a business or your career as an engineer, then it might not be the best place.
yeah, it's hard to put strict labels on it like that. But I feel like
Yeah.
if you want to do like honest, good work and enjoy what you do and have a sensible work life balance and get paid a reasonable amount, Japan is a great place for that. But if you want to come and kind of like bullshit your way into talking about how awesome you are and converting that into some sort of perceived value that someone will give you money for, it's
Right.
doesn't work that way. I think there's too much competition for that, fake it till you make it kind of stuff that we have in Silicon Valley.
Interesting. Well, it matches kind of my own beliefs regarding that. I acknowledge that Japan is not for everyone, even though I'm like, even though I'm trying to help people move here for,
Yeah.
tech jobs and stuff like that. I know that like for me, it's just like first I want to help people figure out if they're a match or not. And if they're not, that's totally fine. If you want to earn 500K a year, just go work at, Facebook or Google or whatever in Silicon
Yeah.
Valley and be a tech lead and you'll make 500K or, whatever, $1 million a year. It's possible there. It's not
Yeah.
here. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So if that's what motivates you, then cool. Now I'll try to show people like the jobs that exist, the companies that are hiring, their salaries that they're paying, and it's like, oh, that's actually so it's not possible to do what I want. I see. Thanks for telling me, and then they don't
Yeah.
come and have that negative experience of being disappointed, right? And
Exactly. And like,
growing to
I
hate
think,
Japan. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's like, I think you definitely get a perspective. I think living outside of your own country, period, but like maybe
Mm,
especially in Japan, is like you learn sort of the power of preference.
mm,
So, like, I think in the US, we attribute a lot of things to bad intentions or bad, like, carrots that are presented.
mm, mm,
But when you're in a different country, you realize, no, that's actually just like what people want to do.
mm,
It's really hard to say, but like, I definitely agree with the idea that like not every place has to support every person, and
mm,
that like personal preferences do matter, and you should go to the
mm.
places that support your preferences.
So I think just lastly, is there anywhere that people can go to kind of learn more about you? Like you have social media, or where do you want to kind of direct people?
Yes, I think the best place probably right now is like my Mastodon or GitHub are probably the best ways to get in touch with me.
All right, perfect. So we'll add a couple links to the description so that people can find you there. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I think there were a lot of great insights, some nuggets in here that will be super useful for anyone who wants to maybe work in Japan and follow a similar path to what you've done. I think your experience is definitely an example of like a success case. You've, I think, had a really great career here. So I was very glad to be able to talk about it. So yeah, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And I definitely encourage anyone that has any questions about it to contact me.
Mm,
Like, no worries. So, yeah, please reach out and I'm happy to answer any questions or anything. So, yeah, thanks for having me on, Eric. And
mm.
please keep working on your website because, no, it's like the best resource
Thank you.
for anyone looking for jobs, like or like any foreigners looking for jobs in
Mm.
Japan, just because the way the data is laid out makes it so much easier to tell like if you'll be able to succeed there.
Thank you so much. I think just lastly, if anyone is watching this and got value from it, please leave a comment, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more interviews, from people like Jeff, because yeah, I'm going to keep these going. I think there's a lot to be learned from stories like this one. So thank you so much for watching. And I think that's it for this episode of the Japan Dev Podcast. Thank you.